topic for the weekend challenge number 1146 over at blenderartist.org was Welcome to the Greatest Show on Earth. For this challenge, I decided to create this clown animation you're watching now. This animation required some technical work in Blender, so I decided to create a video explaining that work. I started off modeling the character props by using a cylinder for the clown hat. Using a cylinder instead of a cone object would allow me to add vertical loop cuts for animating the hat. Then I added in a UV sphere for the ball at the top of the hat. Next I add in my loop cuts for the hat. Now I add in another UV sphere and use it as a basis for the clown hair. I kept duplicating the sphere and moving it around, scaling it to give me the shapes I wanted for the clown hair. I combined all these sphere mesh objects into one mesh object and set the origin to be at the center. I used a mirror modifier to give me hair on the other side of the character's head. Adding in another UV sphere for the clown nose. All these props would later be parented to the character's head control bone for animation. I just used simple materials for newly created props just so I can see what the character will look like. Up next, I wanted to get the ball juggling animation figured out, so I posed the character for the start of the juggling animation loop. I added in a UV sphere for one of the juggling balls. I set the ball to be a child of the character's hip bone, so the animation of the ball would move as the character moves. I then started animating the ball going from one hand up and over, and then down to the other hand, using Blender's motion paths for the ball to help me see how the ball would move. I then animated the ball returning to the starting hand. That was the start of my animation loop. Then I duplicated the ball and moved its keyframes around a dope sheet to give me a second ball. I repeated this process again to give me a third ball. After I had 3 balls animated, I started working on the character animation. I posed the character's hands interacting with the 3 balls. Each hand would catch a ball, then toss the ball, and this action would just repeat. Once I had this animation loop working, I pushed all the animation actions into a nonlinear action editor. Now I set the animation strips to repeat twice, giving me a 60-frame juggling animation loop. To model the unicycle, I started off with a torus for the wheel. I added in a couple of circles and created a few faces between them. I moved this around a bit and extruded to give me some thickness. Then added a mirror modifier. A little bit more extrusion and scaling to give me a rim. Adding in a subsurf modifier, I then extruded and scaled in the center section of the rim. Adding in some loop cuts on the spokes to tighten them up. Next I added a cylinder for the axle and adjusted it, adding a mirror and subsurf modifiers to it. From here on out, the rest of the unicycle was created from basic mesh objects, extruding and scaling as needed, with subsurf and mirror modifiers as needed. For the rig, I just added bones to the character's rig. I created a master bone for the unicycle, then add another bone for the wheel and one more bone for the seat and the forks. I added in a bone for the left pedal, then copied it over for the right pedal. Then I worked on the bone parenting. The wheel and the seat post bones were set to be children of the master bone. The pedal bones were set to be children of the wheel bone. I then parented all the unicycle parts to the bones that would control them. Now I needed to connect the character to the unicycle. I made the character's hip bone be a child of the unicycle seat bone. I made both IK foot controllers be children of the pedal bones. Now when I rotated the wheel, the legs followed along. Also when I moved the unicycle's master bone, everything follows along except for the hands. I had to make the hand bones be children of the hip bone. Changing the hand bone parents screwed up the juggling animation I had already created, so I had to rework the hand juggling animation again. Up next, I created a path for my character and unicycle to follow. I used a follow path constraint on the unicycle's master bone set to fixed position and played around with the offset factor value to move everything along the path. This worked somewhat, but not everything was working correctly. The head wasn't rotating with the body as things moved along the path. There was a hinge setting on the neck bone that fixed that problem. The pedals also didn't rotate properly. I made some adjustments to the pedal bones and used a copy rotation constraint on them targeting the master unicycle bone. I made the same changes to the other pedal bone, and now everything followed along as it moved along the path. Up next, I added a driver to the wheel bone's rotation. The wheel rotation would be driven from the offset factor value on the follow path constraint. The correct way of doing something like this involves knowing the length of the path and the diameter of the wheel and calculating wheel rotation based upon its location on the path. I didn't have time to figure that stuff out, so I just started playing around with multiplying my driver with a few values. I thought a value of 50 looked pretty good. Now I needed to bring all this work together into one animation. I started off by keyframing the follow path constraints offset factor. I started inserting keys at frame 60 so my juggling animation would repeat twice before the unicycle started moving. I moved the unicycle forward and backwards a little first to show some anticipation, and I rotated the seat controller a little bit so the character leaned forwards and backwards. When the character gets to the end of the path, I repeated this forward-backwards movement to show some overlap and follow-through at the end. Then in the NLA editor, I set all my action strips to repeat 9 times so the juggling animation would repeat for the length of the final animation. I then added simple materials to all the new objects I created. Added in a circle mesh and modeled it into a circus ring, adding red and white materials to the ring. I added a spotlight for the main light and adjusted it as needed. Did a few test renders and adjusted or added lights as needed. Once I was happy with the test renders, I rendered the whole animation as single PNG images. With Blender set to video editing work, I loaded in my rendered image sequence. I also added in an audio file I found on the internet. There's a link to the file in the description. I adjusted the timing of the audio clip a bit. Then I rendered this out as an MP4 video file that I uploaded to my Vimeo account. I really wanted to spend more time on the character animation, as it looks very robotic, but didn't have any time left to work on that before the deadline for the challenge. Deadline is a deadline. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for watching. Have a good day.